I want to talk to you today about another paradox of Deontic logic. Deontic logic is the logic of obligation and permission, basic ethical concepts. And this paradox has been described by Hector Neri Castaneda as the most fundamental, the deepest of the Deontic paradoxes. Why? Because it relies only on modus ponens and this principle of closure under logical consequence, that if something's obligatory and something else follows logically from it, it too must be obligatory. Well, that does seem like a very plausible principle. I mentioned an example last time about meeting friends at a restaurant, but that applies much more broadly. Suppose I ought to buy a car. It seems plausible then that I ought to buy a vehicle. If I ought to buy a larger car, then I ought to buy a car, and so on. It follows logically from those things, and so it seems like a natural inference. But in fact, it can get us into trouble. And so here is the example. It's from a book by James Forrester. It's called The Gentle Murder Paradox. Here's the paradox. Smith should not murder Jones. Murder is wrong. And so there should be no murder. Smith should not murder Jones. But if Smith murders Jones, then Smith should murder Jones gently. Better to kill someone gently than to kill them savagely. Now let's say Smith does murder Jones. It seems to follow, by modus ponens, that then Smith ought to murder Jones gently. But now, that closure under logical consequence principle comes into play. If that's true, then it appears that, well, since Smith ought to kill Jones gently, and you can kill someone gently only if you kill them, then Smith ought to murder Jones. But wait a minute. We started out by assuming that Smith should not murder Jones. So just by saying, Smith does kill Jones, if Smith kills Jones, Smith should kill Jones gently. It follows that Smith should kill Jones gently, but you kill someone gently only if you kill them, so Smith ought to kill Jones. Ooh, we've just gone from Smith killing Jones to it ought to be the case that Smith kills Jones. Now, actually, we could substitute anything here for Smith murders Jones, and so here I'm using murder and killed equivalently, sloppily, but nevertheless just to avoid saying the same word over and over again until you get semantically saturated with it. It looks as if we can take any proposition P and say, well, if you're going to do P, you ought to do it in this fashion. You can do it in that fashion only if you do it. So we go from the truth of P to the fact that it ought to be the case that P. Something is seriously wrong with a principle that allows us to do that. It looks like it trivializes all of Deontic logic. And that's why Castaneda described it as the deepest of the Deontic paradoxes. So what can we do about this? Well, we could give up that principle of logical consequence, but that seems like an extreme alternative. And so, is there another way out? I think there is, but we're going to have to wait for another video to see how to escape the gentle murder paradox.